Hey wood turners, Dave Muller, the Aggie Turner here. In this video, we're going to turn something that's probably different from anything else that you've ever turned before. About a month ago, a good friend and fellow turner, Rick Taylor, stopped by my shop, said, "Dave, I want to show you something." And he handed me this. This is a dummy, 30 millimeter round from an A10 Warthog. That plane fires 70 of these per second. And the projectile weighs about a half a pound. That's 35 pounds that plane fires downrange every second. Well, I knew Rick wouldn't let me keep it, so I thought, it's round, we ought to turn our own. And that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to turn this from this dummy. Before we start turning this round, I thought I'd show you a drawing that I made of the original dummy round. This has all of the dimensions taken from that round, and if you want to turn a round that is historically accurate, they're all here for you. We're not going to use all these dimensions when we turn a round like this today. We're going to take a much simpler approach. We're going to start with a 2" by 2" by 14" long maple blank. I'm going to put tenons on each end, and then I'm going to turn a 6½ long cylinder, 1 3/4 inches in diameter. That'll become the brass casing. And then from there, turn the additional 5 inches at 1 1/4 inches in diameter, which will become the projectile. I'll then come back and turn this little chamfer, and then I'll shape the projectile. Now you can use these dimensions to shape the projectile, or you can put whatever shape on there looks reasonable to you. There are 4 details in here that I think steps this up a notch and really makes it look accurate. And those are, 1, to add a primer in a 3/4 inch hole in the back end, to cut this little detail here, which is, I believe, an extraction ring used to pull the empty casing out of the chamber. There are 2 little crimp rings here that are used to crimp the projectile into the casing. And the 4th one are these 2 white rings here, which on the original dummy round are plastic, and I think they're used to seal the round in the barrel. Now it will only take you about 2 minutes to turn each one of these details, so I think they're well worth the effort. So let's get started. While the piece was between centers, I turned this to an outer diameter of about 1.8 inches, and then I came back with a nice flat piece of wood. This is MDF, has a flat surface. Held a piece of sandpaper on here and used that to sand out any ridges that I had left, because I don't want people to pick this up and feel ridges from turning. That got it down to about 175. Then I cut tenons on each end while it was between centers, took it out from between centers, mounted one end in a chuck. Now I'm going to drill this in. So I used the chuck and my live center to center it in that little center dipple. Now I'm going to pull this out, put the 3/4 inch Forstner bit, which is nice and sharp, just sharpened it, in a tailstock and drill a hole. And I'm only going to drill it about 1 inch deep. I just want to go deep enough so that I go past the tenon and past where I'm going to cut off, so there's enough of a hole to put the primer in. So let's go ahead and drill that hole. I'm going to bring it up and put the tip of the Forstner bit in that little dimple so that it stays centered. Lock it down, run at about 500 RPM, and let's drill the hole. Okay, the hole is drilled. Now I'm going to swap ends so that I have the end with the hole in the chuck, put my live center back in and use the dimple in this end to center the piece. So that it turns true. And we'll tighten it up nice and tight, because now we're going to be doing work out here 10 and 11 inches, and I want this to be stable and not move. I'm now going to put a mark about 3/8 of an inch from the chuck jaws, just far enough so that I have room to part this off later. So I'll put a mark there. This will be my 0 reference line. I'm also going to put a mark at 6 and a mark at 6.5 inches. The mark at 6 and 6.5 inches is where this chamfer will be. I've set my calipers to 1.25 inches, a little bit greater than that. And I'm going to use my parting tool now at the 6.5 inch line to part down to that dimension and make a stop cut there. Then I'll probably do 2 more down here further, just so that I can use that to gauge the diameter of this part of the cylinder. Now I'll go ahead and turn this down to that diameter. I'm going to go ahead and waste the rest of this wood down to that approximate diameter, because I know everything is smaller than this diameter down on this end. I finished my depth stop, and then I went ahead and leveled it off to about 1.3 inches down the length here. Then I used a skew to do a planing cut to take it down to 1.25. And as you can see, I'm right at 1.25. Then I sanded it with the sanding block so it's nice and flat. Now you can see, if we reference the back end here, that the 6-inch line is the beginning of the transition, and the 6.5-inch line is the bottom of the chamfer. So now I'll just use my spindle gouge to cut this chamfer from this line down into where the corner is. So now I'm going to turn the projectile, and I need to put marks at 7 3/4, 9, and 11. Now the projectile ends at 11.5, but we're going to leave this last part on there so that we can turn all this and still have support. So the depth at the 9-inch mark is 1.1 inches diameter. And I set my calipers, I set them using my dial gauge. You don't have to be that accurate, but I just thought I would go ahead and use that since I have it. I put a mark out here at 11.5, which is the end of the projectile, so I know where that is. I know that the diameter at the 7 3/4 inch mark is the correct diameter, so I don't want to reduce that any more than it already is. So I'll start turning down here and work my way back to this until I have a nice smooth curve down to the diameter that I cut here. I've done a rough turn here. I can feel that there's a low spot right here, a little high spot here, and I know that I'm a little thick here. I measured it again. So I'm going to come in and try to take this out and reduce that size just a little bit. That feels a lot better. I've still got a little high spot here and here. A little shear scraping. That's much better. Now I'll come back and use sandpaper to smooth this out. That feels pretty good. Go to 220. That feels nice. There's a nice smooth transition, no ridges. Got a little bit of a ridge here. I'm going to take it out. That feels good. To cut this detail, I put a mark at 1/4 of an inch up from the zero line and 1/2 inch up from the zero line. And that's the area that I will now cut out with a parting tool. I've set my calipers to 1.5 inches. Not a critical dimension, but we need to be down below this surface, which is about 1 3/4. Let's go ahead and turn that down. We'll just turn a square groove here with the parting tool, making sure the bottom is nice and flat. Now I'll flatten out the bottom of the groove. Now I'll come back with my spindle gouge and just put a small chamfer right on this edge here. No specific dimensions. I've reestablished my mark at 6.5 inches, which corresponds to the bottom of the chamfer, at 7 inches, which is the end of the brass casing, and at 7 3/4, which is the end of this outer ring. Then I came in and I divided this first section into thirds just by eye. There's nothing magic about that. Doesn't have to be accurate. And this is where we're going to put the crimp rings. You can go ahead and turn those using the point of a skew. So I'll simply put the skew on the tool rest and then drop the point into the 2 rings. Now the grooves in the prototype were not narrow as we produced from the skew. They were a little wider and round bottom. I decided I want to go ahead and get that effect. It's fine to leave it this way. I think the detail is there. What I did is grind a special tool. This is just 3/16 inch tool steel stock. And I just ground a little round tip there that I'm going to use as a scraper. So either way works fine. This is just something I preferred to do. So hopefully you can see that that gives me just a little bit of a round bottom, a little wider. Whatever you choose, it's your choice. All right, time to turn the last detail, and that's these two white simulated plastic rings. I put some additional marks on the turning here, so it might look a little confusing. This mark here is the original 7 3/4, and this mark here is the original 7-inch. And what I did is I came back from the 7 3/4 and put a mark 1/4 inch back. Then I put another mark 1/8 of an inch back, another mark 1/4 of an inch back, and that left me the last 1/8 inch here. Then I colored in the first 1/8 inch, the second 1/8 inch, and then also up here to the right of this 7 3/4. What I'm going to do is come in with my parting tool and simply do a shallow cut in each of these marked areas. All I want to do is define an edge. I don't need to be very deep, maybe 10 thousandths, 15 thousandths is all. But I want these edges to be nice and sharp, so when we paint this and this white, it's easy. And also when people feel it, they feel a nice edge there. So I'm going to come in with my thin parting tool. My other parting tool is too wide to get in these narrow spaces. And I will cut these two areas, then I'll cut this edge and work my way down a little bit. That'll leave a little bit of an edge that will go ahead and sand in to make it smooth. Again, don't want anybody to feel edges here. So I'm looking up here at the top. Gentle side to side. Second one. Again, a gentle side to side. And finally, this edge. This one's a little shallow. I'm going to go back and do this a bit deeper. And this one as well. And that's it. So I'll go ahead and we'll sand these, being careful not to sand out the detail. And then we'll move on to parting off the tip. It's time to part off the end here and finish the tip of the projectile. My 11.5 inch mark is right there, so I'm going to part just that side of the mark, part this off completely, and then we'll finish turning the tip of the projectile and sand it. Because I'm so far leveraged out here, I'm going to finish cutting this off with my little saw. There we are. Now I know this is well supported from the chuck, so I can just gently turn this end now and finish the profile of the projectile on the tip. I was surprised at how blunt this tip was on the dummy round. I thought it would have been sharper, but regardless, we'll go ahead and sand this to the proper shape, and then we'll start painting. Now 220, and then 400. The first step in painting is to set this edge, and I did that by using a parting tool to make a shallow cut from the zero reference edge, which was right here, back towards the chuck. Remember, you don't want to go too deep because there's a 3/4 inch deep hole in this end. I then applied 2 coats of spray white primer, and I sanded after each coat with 400 grit sandpaper so that this is a nice smooth surface. Remember, this is going to look like a simulated metal surface. The first color we're going to apply is this acrylic gold paint that we'll modify with a little black to tone it down. And we'll apply it from this end down to the top end of the casing, which is right here. The first color I'm going to use will be a mixture of this gold and black acrylic paint. I think any acrylic paint will do. I believe I bought these either at Michael's or Dick Blick's. When you buy the gold, be sure that you buy one that has very small gold flakes. Some have larger gold flakes which really don't look like brass, which is what we're trying to simulate. And to tone this down, I'm going to add just a little bit of the black so it's not quite as bright. I'm going to mix it in this little disposable container and just put a drop of black in there. And I'm going to paint it with this brush, which is an artist brush. It's nylon. It's a very fine bristle. It leaves very few brush marks when we paint, and that's important because we're trying to look like a metal surface. To tone down the gold, I'm going to put just a very small amount of black on the end of my stick here. It doesn't take a whole lot. And mix this in. I want to make sure that this is completely mixed so I don't get any black streaks in the paint. That looks about right. I'm going to start by applying the paint with the lathe running, and then I'll come back and smooth it out. I'm set at my lowest speed, which is about, I don't know, 20 RPM, something like that. I'm going to reverse it so it's pointing away from me. One thing you want to be careful of is running out of paint here. It's going to be kind of hard to match this color. The first coat doesn't cover very well, but once we get the second coat on, it'll look much better. I let the first coat dry. I've now sanded it to remove any little ridges that might have been left. And now I will paint the second coat on and let it dry. Now it's time to paint the projectile. So I'm going to take the paint that was left over from the casing and put a little more black paint with it to darken it down. I use the same brush, turn at the same speed, and apply the paint. As with the first coat on the casing, it doesn't completely cover, so we'll let this dry and then come back and apply a second coat. After the first coat dried, I sanded it, especially these white rings here, to get rid of some of the color. I then applied a second coat. And on the second coat, I diluted it down with water because this is artist paint for painting pictures, not for giving nice smooth finishes. And I did want a nice smooth finish here. To finish the white rings, I'm using the white unmodified with any black, but I am thinning it about 20% with some water so it goes on nice and smooth. I'll be using a much smaller brush here just so that I don't go over into the other areas that are already painted. I put one more coat on the white rings and they look pretty good now. It's dry. So now it's time to part this off. I'm going to part it off right here at the 0 reference line. I'm going to part straight in. Remember that there's a 3/4 inch diameter hole in here, so we don't have to part very far. I just sharpened the parting tool, so I got a nice clean cut. Now I'll just use my knife to clean off the last few bits of this ragged edge. I finished sanded the back surface here and we'll paint it offline to the same color as the casing. We now have a 3/4 inch diameter hole. It's about a 1/2 inch deep. I took the piece that we parted off of this end that had a tenon on it and I've mounted it back in the chuck. I've set my calipers to a 3/4 inch diameter. I put a mark at about a 1/2 inch back, and we'll use a parting tool to cut this down to a cylinder, 3/4 inch diameter, a 1/2 inch long. I've trued this up to 3/4 of an inch and make sure that the test fit goes on easily. There's just a little bit of slop, but I'm going to paint this, so that's going to take up some of the space. I'm going to go ahead and finish sanding the end of this and put a little bit of a detail in here just so that it doesn't look like a flat piece of wood. And then I'll paint it black. I use my spindle gouge to put a small dimple in the very center, and then I'll use the point tool to add a couple of rings. I put a couple of coats of black paint on here, now part it off at the base. Well, the final step is to glue the primer cutoff into the hole that was drilled earlier. In my case, the hole was a little too deep for the primer and it sat down below this surface. So I put a spacer under it before I glued it in. That way I only had the primer slightly below this surface, which is the way it was in the dummy round. Well, that's how I turned an A10 30mm round. If you have any young boys in your family, I know they would love to have one of these sitting on their bookshelf. My grandson Caden's looking forward to getting this one. It was a fun project, so think about turning one yourself.